You reach for the salt shaker without even thinking. It sits on your table, a silent, unassuming guest at every meal. Perhaps you reach for it before you've even tasted the food. It's a reflex, an unconscious movement, as natural as breathing. But that simple, thoughtless act is a miracle of the modern world. For the vast, overwhelming majority of human existence, that simple act was utterly impossible. What you're about to sprinkle on your food was once one of the most strategically important, geopolitically significant, and in many, many places, the hardest to find material on the entire planet. The story of that substance on your table is not just about flavor, it's about the rise and fall of empires. It's about the very wiring of your brain. This isn't just a habit you've picked up, it's a biological instruction, a desperate primordial alarm written directly into your nervous system hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years ago. That craving you sometimes feel, that specific, undeniable desire for something salty, that's ancient history speaking directly to you. This mineral has built empires and it has started bloody revolutions. It has served as a currency, a revolutionary technology, and it was the absolute key that allowed our ancestors to unlock new territories and eventually conquer the planet. The story of salt is, in a very real way, the story of who we are. So, where does this story begin? When did our ancestors first look at a crystal of salt and decide to purposefully eat it? The answer, it turns out, isn't a single date you can circle on a calendar. It's a sweeping two-part epic. The first part is a story of biology, a tale of a need so fundamental it is literally written into the code of your cells. The other part is a story of crisis, a moment in history when a simple mineral deficiency threatened to derail human progress, and our own ingenuity was forced to answer the call. Before we can dig into history, we have to talk about biology. We have to understand the why. Why do you crave salt? Why does it feel so essential? The simplest answer is this: because you are, in essence, a walking, talking, thinking bag of salty water. That's not a metaphor, it's a biological reality. Deep inside you, sodium is a critical electrolyte. Now, electrolyte is a word we hear all the time, but what does it actually mean? Think of your body as an incredibly complex biological machine, and running through that machine is an intricate electrical grid, your nervous system. Sodium is the copper wire in that grid. It's the conductor. It carries the tiny electric charges that allow your nerves to fire, your brain to process information, and your muscles to contract. Every single thought you have, every memory you recall, every beat of your heart is powered by this unimaginably complex current. And that current depends on sodium. Without enough of it, the entire grid starts to fail. It's like a city experiencing a brownout. Lights flicker, systems become unreliable, your nerve signals misfire, your muscles can't get the electrical instructions they need to move properly. It's a catastrophic systems failure at the most basic level of your being. But it doesn't stop there. The balance of water in your body also spins completely out of control. Think of sodium as a shepherd and all the water molecules in your body as its flock. Where sodium goes, water follows, absolutely and without question. This fundamental relationship is the very bedrock of your blood pressure, your body's fluid balance, and the health of every single cell. Because of this, your body is a ruthless, unflinching accountant when it comes to sodium. It keeps a perfect ledger. Specialized sensors in your heart, your blood vessels, and your kidneys monitor your sodium levels constantly, 24 hours a day. If those levels dip even slightly, a cascade of hormonal alarms is triggered. Your brain screams a command to your kidneys: hold on to salt at all costs. Do not let any more escape. This system isn't an accident of evolution. It was forged in a prehistoric world where sodium was profoundly scarce. Your body is hardwired by default to conserve it, to hoard it, to treat it like the precious resource it was. To keep the lights on, to keep the entire system running, you only really need a tiny amount of sodium a day, somewhere between 200 and 500 milligrams. That's less than a quarter of a single teaspoon of salt, a minuscule amount, and yet the craving can feel primal, overwhelming. That craving is the ghost of your evolutionary past. It's a voice from deep time, echoing across millennia with one single urgent message: find the salt. For millions of years, survival meant listening to that voice. For the vast majority of human history, there were no salt shakers. There were no salt mines, no salt pans, no salt roads. For our Paleolithic ancestors, living as hunters and gatherers, getting enough sodium wasn't about finding a mineral, it was part of the hunt. Their primary source wasn't a white crystal, it was the flesh and blood of the animals they pursued. Early humans with a diet rich in animal products had a massive built-in advantage. Meat, and especially nutrient-dense blood and organs, contain significant amounts of sodium. An animal's body is a reservoir of salty fluid, a kind of pre-packaged, perfectly balanced meal with the seasoning already included. By consuming the whole animal, a practice known as nose-to-tail eating, hunter-gatherers were efficiently consuming the sodium their prey had already collected and stored in its own body. This diet, supplemented by other sources, provided a steady, reliable source. For groups living near coastlines, seafood was another easy win, naturally saturated with the salt of the ocean. For them, salt wasn't a separate ingredient to be added. It was simply an intrinsic part of the food they ate. But their lives were incredibly physically demanding, especially in the hot, sun-beaten savannas of Africa, where our species first evolved. They ran, they walked, they hunted, they worked, and in that heat they sweated. Sweat costs you water, but it also costs you sodium, a lot of it. This is where keen observation became a critical survival skill. Early humans watched the world around them with an intensity we can barely imagine. They watched the animals. They saw massive herds of gazelle, elephants, and other grazers flocking to very specific, seemingly unremarkable places, natural salt licks where minerals seeped up from the ground, mineral springs bubbling with brine, and vast, cracked, evaporated salt pans left behind by seasonal rains. It is almost certain that our ancestors followed them. They used the animals as four-legged guides, living signposts, leading them directly to nature's salt pantries. The strategy was brutally simple: go where the animals go, drink where they drink, eat what they eat from the earth. But that strategy, as effective as it was, had a brutal geographic flaw. These life-giving salt deposits are not evenly distributed across the earth. They are geological accidents. For many early human groups, especially those living deep inland, far from oceans or mineral springs, sodium scarcity was a persistent, low-grade stress. It wasn't a blaring emergency siren, threatening immediate death. It was more like the low-fuel light in a car, a constant, nagging reminder that you were running on fumes, that you were one crisis away from a complete breakdown. This was a world of opportunistic consumption. It wasn't production, it was discovery. For hundreds of thousands of years, this was the status quo. The biological alarm for sodium would ring, and our ancestors would answer it by hunting or fishing, or by following the great herds across the plains. And then, around 10,000 years ago, the single greatest innovation in all of human history shattered that ancient balance and created a brand new, terrifyingly urgent problem. That world-changing innovation was the agricultural revolution. Humans began to trade their wandering, nomadic lifestyle for a settled one. They learned to cultivate crops, they domesticated animals, they built villages that became towns and towns that became cities. And this fundamental shift in how we lived changed everything about our relationship with salt. The new diet, centered on the miracle of staple crops like wheat, rice, and corn, had a hidden, almost invisible deficiency. In making this trade, humanity was like someone trading a rich, complex, flavorful stew for a lifetime of simple bread. The stew, made from a dozen different ingredients, had all the salt you needed cooked right in. The bread, however, had almost none. Cereal grains, the very foundation of this new agricultural world, have virtually no sodium. Suddenly, and for the first time, a huge portion of humanity was facing a collective, chronic sodium deficit. The biological need hadn't changed at all. People were still working hard in the fields, sweating under the sun, and their bodies still screamed for the sodium required to function, but their primary food source was no longer providing it. The entire human species was suddenly running a massive nutritional deficit, like a country whose main export, the one thing that propped up its entire economy, had just vanished overnight. The problem was dangerously compounded by their newly settled lives. Hunter-gatherers could roam. If a local area was depleted of a resource, they could simply move on. But farmers were tied to their fields, their homes, their communities. They couldn't just wander off for weeks or months searching for a distant mineral deposit. Their survival depended on being there for the harvest. And it wasn't just them. Their domesticated animals, their walking sources of labor, milk, and emergency food, were also eating the same grain-based diet. They too were becoming sodium deficient. Watching their precious livestock instinctively lick rocks, eat dirt, and seek out any trace of salt they could find would have been a powerful daily reminder of its life or death importance. The stage was set for a crisis. The biological need was ancient and unyielding. The new environment and lifestyle, however, had created a catastrophic gap. A problem had emerged that hunting and gathering could no longer solve. The old ways were broken. The sodium deficit, sparked and sustained by the agricultural revolution, demanded a human solution. We could no longer just find salt, we had to make it. We had to control it. This critical shift from discovery to production marks the true beginning of our relationship with salt, not just as a nutrient, but as a commodity. The evidence for this momentous transition is elusive. Salt, by its very nature, dissolves. It leaves few direct traces for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. So instead, they look for the tools of production, the industrial fingerprints left behind, and some of the oldest, most definitive evidence for organized salt production appears right around the time agriculture was taking deep root across the world. One of the most significant and evocative sites is in Romania, at a place called Poiana Slatinei. Here, around 6000 BCE, a staggering 8,000 years ago, people were systematically exploiting a natural brine spring. What archaeologists discovered was not a simple camp, but what they described as a dedicated salt-making facility. They unearthed a huge mound of ash and charcoal, packed with countless fragments of thick-walled, crudely made ceramic vessels. The process they were using, a technique now called briquettage, was the birth of an industry. It was like the inverse of making tea. Instead of steeping something to flavor the water, they were boiling the brine over a constant fire, forcing the water to evaporate out, leaving behind a pure, transportable cake of crystallized salt. The sheer number of broken pots discarded after use suggests this wasn't an occasional activity. This was continuous, organized labor, season after season, year after year. And this was not an isolated event, a single stroke of genius. Similar evidence appears in different forms at different times all across the globe. In China, by the Neolithic and Bronze Age, salt springs in the interior became vital resources, controlled by emerging dynasties. In Britain, archaeological evidence of salt making dates back to the late Neolithic period. In the Andes of Peru, ancient communities who lived far from the sea meticulously built shallow, terraced basins to capture and evaporate the water from salty inland springs. This wasn't a coincidence. It's a perfect example of convergent innovation. It's like how different cultures all over the world, with no contact with one another, independently invented the roof, because everywhere, eventually, it rains. Farming had created a universal problem, and people everywhere, using the resources they had, invented a very similar solution. In that moment, salt ceased to be just a mineral. It was transformed into white gold. Once humans learned to reliably produce salt, they didn't just solve a dietary problem, they unknowingly unlocked a new form of power that would reshape human society itself. The first and most immediate power was preservation. Before refrigeration, spoilage was the constant, relentless enemy of civilization. Your ability to store food was your ability to survive winter, to withstand a bad harvest, to feed an army. Salt acts like a microscopic, hyper-effective bouncer for your food. Through the process of osmosis, it aggressively pulls moisture out of cells. For the bacteria, yeast, and molds that cause rot, this is a death sentence. Salt turns a juicy piece of meat or fish into a microbial desert where they simply cannot survive. With salt, meat and fish could suddenly be preserved for months, even years. This technological leap allowed armies to march on preserved rations, far from their homelands. It allowed sailors to cross vast, open oceans, secure in the knowledge they wouldn't starve. Salt was a critical enabler for humanity's quest to conquer time and distance. With a valuable, life-sustaining product came trade, and with trade came wealth and power. Great trade routes were carved out of the wilderness specifically for salt. The Via Salaria, or Salt Road, is one of the oldest and most important Roman roads, built for the express purpose of moving salt from the coastal salt pans of Ostia to the growing city of Rome and the interior of the Italian peninsula. Entire cities, like Salzburg in Austria, whose name literally means salt fortress, grew immensely wealthy and powerful by controlling local salt mines. The Witch in many English town names, like Northwich or Middlewich, often marks them as historic salt production centers. Where there is trade and wealth, there is power and taxation. The word salary comes from the Latin word salarium. The popular story, told for centuries, is that this was a special allowance given to Roman soldiers specifically to buy salt. While modern historians debate that direct, literal link, the very origin of the word shows how deeply salt was tied to the concept of value and payment. Governments quickly realized this. Salt, a substance every single citizen needed to live, was the perfect commodity to control and tax. Salt monopolies became a key source of revenue for empires from ancient China to medieval Europe. The gabelle, a notoriously hated salt tax in France that made the price of salt different in every province, was one of the many deep-seated grievances that fueled the explosive French Revolution. And in the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi's famous 1930 Salt March was not about seasoning. It was a brilliant act of civil disobedience, a 240-mile protest against a colonial power that dared to tax a substance that 1 billion Indian bodies biologically needed to function. We have traveled back 8,000 years to a smoky, fire-lit hut in Romania. We have watched herds on the African savanna and marched with Roman legions along the Via Salaria. And now, after all that, we come back to you, in your kitchen, reaching for the salt shaker. That urge you feel, that little spark of desire for a salty taste, is an echo of this entire epic story. It is the voice of your distant Paleolithic ancestors, hardwired to seek out a scarce and vital nutrient. It is the phantom hunger of the first farmers, whose bodies were screaming for the sodium their new grain-based diet tragically lacked. Your brain is running ancient software, an operating system calibrated for a world of profound scarcity. The problem is, you don't live in that world anymore. You live in a world of staggering, unprecedented abundance. For the very first time in all of human history, salt is cheap, ubiquitous, and packed into nearly every processed food you can buy. The very craving that ensured our survival for millennia now contributes to modern health problems because our ancient, hardwired instinct is dangerously mismatched with our modern, salt-saturated environment. So, when did humans first start eating salt? The answer is a fascinating paradox. We have always eaten it, getting what we needed from our food for hundreds of thousands of years, guided by instinct. But the moment that truly changed the world was when we started producing it around 8,000 years ago. That was the moment when human ingenuity met a biological crisis head-on, and in solving it, unleashed a force that built roads, financed armies, and created the world we now inhabit. The next time you pick up that shaker, pause for just a second. You're not just holding a condiment, you are holding the crystallized history of civilization. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of curious person this channel exists for. We love exploring the surprising, hidden origins of our everyday world, and we do it every single week. Let us know in the comments what common item you've always been curious about. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deeper storytelling is worth keeping alive.